Hi, Jen.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. We are meeting today to discuss education in general, John Taylor Gatto and education in general. And today is just sort of an introductory sort of opening thing. And I thought it might be helpful to introduce ourselves. I've been running Avalon Mentors for a few years now, with off and on doing tutoring, mentoring, posting things here and there. So it's sort of a developing thing still. But my concern primarily is with people that are in the education field, parents who have children that they're working with, people that have seen that something might be up with education and want an alternative. I've been teaching for 30 years, doing literature and history and language, and and have definite opinions on education. So that's my bio, if you will. And that's letting people know who I am. How about you? What's your story, as they say?
Yeah, well, currently I'm teaching high school literature to ninth graders. This will be my third year teaching in a brick and mortar school. And previous to that, I was educating my own children and I was involved in various co-ops over the years. So it's been, if you count it all, it's been about 13 years of education on my part, but different modes of it. And I think being in a brick and mortar school has really kind of opened my eyes to something that I had read about and I had suspected and had thoughts about, but now I'm seeing it kind of unfold in real time.
Hmm.
Seeing just, I don't know, different effects that I guess we could say that modern education is having on our children. So, yeah.
So that's an interesting stepping off point here. Full disclosure for anybody who is wondering, Jen was my student way back when, I think early 2000s, if I remember right, wasn't it? Does that sound right
It
to
was.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
See, I think
Very.
you were
Mm-hmm.
there at the inception of the school up there in Minnesota, Providence, 2001, where we had the baptism by fire because of the 911 thing.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
yeah, I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught you off and on for about 4 years until you graduated. And my math is bad, so what, 2005? Is that right?
Yep.
2006 when
Yep.
you graduated? Okay.
2007. Mm-hmm.
When you graduated from Providence, what was the effect of the education you got at Providence that was positive, that changed you as a person? Could you talk about that for just a minute?
Right. So prior to Providence, I had been in the public school system. And from what I gather from the things people say, but also from, different statistics you see floating around, the public education in Minnesota is supposed to be pretty good, especially where I was coming from, which was, a particular school district there. But it was increasingly strange, the things that I was learning in public school and the ways in which I was being asked to learn them. So much so that my parents thought we really need to figure out something different. And this is not a good fit for our child, for his education. So we ended up at Providence, and it was I guess I could just describe it as whiplash for me in the beginning. But after acclimating, it really was fascinating to me to actually read a book and talk about the book and understand the book.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And I think that that sounds very simple and it sounds almost silly to say that that's what was so different. But I think that that's kind of where it all started was that we were reading actual poetry, we were reading actual books, and then we were talking about them and we were being led through them. And we were being asked for our own thoughts on these books, and given various, forms of feedback on that. So along the way, of course, there was writing instruction and other modes of that. But primarily, I think the ideas, the books themselves, the stories that we were engaging in, that was the thing that was so different for me.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Certainly, Providence at the time was experimental to a certain degree because we were starting the school off not from scratch, but from sort of a ground up attitude, and so we were seeing what worked and didn't. I've often teased myself and brought this up with you, but I know I made a lot of mistakes in my 30 years of teaching, and thought that sometimes things were accessible to young people that weren't accessible. So like the drama class that I taught, where I taught Nietzsche and Aristotle to you ninth graders, and then you guys suffer through that. But I think that and yes, folks, I really did that. That's a real story. Um, but I think that the what you brought up just a minute ago is pretty pertinent, and kind of fits into what we want to talk about with the Gatto, because the public school system, one would be remiss to say that there was nothing wrong in the public school system, but one might be remiss to say that there was nothing wrong in the system of American education, period. Everything's rosy in American education. That does not seem to be the case. Certainly that podcast that we've been listening to so far, which is Sold a Story, it's a good podcast to sort of be an eye-opening thing to show us that the reading aspect, the whole language thing, has done damage to the reading aspect. And I think that the public schools, there are a lot of good people in the public schools, a lot of people trying hard, but it seems like the public schools have had a real problem, not just with training students to the technical business of reading and mathematics and other things. I'm not really qualified in that vein, but they've also had a problem with the having people read original works, like you just said. Reading a book is, as you said, it seemed silly that you had not read a book, but it's not silly. It's more like this was a decision that was made sometime in the 70s, I think, to not read full books. And I remember when I was going through public school back in the day, Jesus and the Indians way back, that I had this similar experience. I went to Lake Section School. That was the last public school I went to, was Lake Section School in Three Rivers, Michigan. It was a decent school for what it was, but we didn't read full books. We read maybe one or two books. And I remember reading Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret. I remember reading The Pig Man. I remember reading a couple other popular books, like contemporary books at the time. I don't think I read a single classic book at all. I didn't read any of the great authors. I didn't read anything. And mind you, this is up to sixth grade. So it wasn't like I had to read Homer in fifth grade or anything. But I wasn't reading full books. I was reading snippets out of a textbook. So they hadn't produced, I don't think yet, the full compendium textbooks that we see now. But they did have these readers that you would have, and they would have a snippet that you would read. And the section that you would read would be your reading for the day or reading for assignment. And it would be accompanied with historical readings, and then also what was happening currently. So it was almost like a weekly reader thing that we did. And that kind of set me up to not want to read hardly at all. My parents laughed that I didn't want to read a book. I read Mad Magazine until I was in fifth or sixth grade. I didn't like to read hardly at all. And even through sixth grade, I remember vividly reading my first book, which was a version of Gowan and the Green Knight in sixth grade. Admittedly, it was a annotated, version. So it was, what do you call it? Truncated or whatever. But I felt quite proud of myself. We had a combined classrooms. They were doing experimental education to us at the time. And so we had combined classrooms, and we had a loft that we would go up to read, and beanbag chairs and these cozy nooks and things that we would go into to read. And I remember going up into the loft and reading Gowan and the Green Knight. And that was all fun and games for us as kids. But there was never any real rigor for me until I was in seventh grade. And that was my first Catholic school experience. And it was in Catholic school that I was encouraged to read actual books and to begin reading the actual full poetry or the actual histories. So my own education, that was all in the late 70s and early 80s. My own education really did not thrive until ninth grade, when I attended Trinity School. And Trinity School was a new thing at the time. They were setting up their education system so that they were going back to the great books with Malcolm Muggeridge. I think that was his idea. and reading a course of books over the year and then over the 4 years that would correspond with other things that they were doing. So they created a whole world of thought, what they called a community of learners. And that was very effective for me. I had the same kind of culture shock that you were talking about, though, my ninth grade year, where I came from, being proud for reading an annotated version of Gowan and the Green Knight, to suddenly having to read things like the Federalist Papers, and Edgar Allan Poe and Red Badge of Courage, things like that. I'd never done that before. So ninth grade for me was also a culture shock when I first hit that in 1984. But the 80s were a period where they were beginning to create not just weekly readers, but these full textbooks, which now seem to be part of the problem. I mean, the textbooks themselves they're only chunks of literature surrounded by lots of pretty pictures and graphs and cute questions for the kids.
Yeah.
And so you don't read a full text in public school all the way through 12th grade. I talked to 12th graders and they've said when they go through the public school system, I've never read a book. I don't even know what reading a book is. I read textbooks that have the sections and the chunks in them, and one wonders, what does that do to you psychologically when you don't read a full text? What does that begin to do to a person? Um, did it do anything to you that you will look back on and say, well, did that hinder me, or did that make it more difficult for me, or did that impede me?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. When you were speaking about how you didn't like to read until you had read that Sir Gawain story, and I
Yeah.
had an interestingly similar experience that kind of went the opposite way. So, as a small child, I loved to read. I was a voracious reader. I mean, I remember my mom telling me stories of when I first began to read. It surprised her because she didn't know I could read.
Mm.
And I remember just devouring books every chance I could get. But there was some period of time starting around fourth or fifth grade where I became less and less interested in reading. And I think
Mm.
that it had a lot to do with the fact that as we approached middle school, and in middle school, that was the height of it for me in public education, was reading these same strange snippets that you were saying and having to dissect the snippets. So, like when you spoke about there was a set of questions that went along with, your
Yes.
truncated reading. As a kid, you figure that out really fast. You're like, A, I don't like what this is. I don't want to do this thing, and they're making me answer these questions. So you look for the answer to the question in the snippet that they're having you read, and you regurgitate it onto the
Yep.
thing. And then, you check it off your list, boom, done. I don't have to read again. Right. And so
Yes.
I
Yes.
think that it just really did, for me, in my experience, kill any love of reading I had. And it took a very long time for that to reawaken in me. And it wasn't
That's a
until having
great
you
point.
answer, that I wanted to read again.
Yeah. Am I giving you Nietzsche? Um,
So, yeah.
but that's a really, really good point because
No, it
John,
wasn't Nietzsche. It was not.
yeah, well, I don't know if I could read Nietzsche myself now. Um, John Gatto, when we'll see this when we get to the text, but John Gatto makes this point is that the educational system in America became a bureaucratization of education. It became almost a machine work of education, and I think that's something that a lot of people now are rebelling against. I mean, they were rebelling against it when I went through the third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade at Lake section. They were trying. I God bless the teachers I had. They were doing the best they could with what they had. They were trying to fight back against a system that had been in place since the 1840s, 1850s, which was this bureaucratization model. And then John Gatto rebels against that too. But even there, I think that they weren't. I mean, they did it by hanging things from the ceiling and making the beanbag chairs, and kind of being loosey goosey with the schedule during the day. But that really didn't solve the problem because we were still reading, like you said, we're reading the snippets and then answering those questions. And I did the same thing. I found the way to give the teacher what they wanted, not engage with the text, think about the text, get enjoyment out of the text, or even just to get through the story. I was with you. I was pretty. I enjoyed being read to and having stories from my parents. My mom likes to joke that my earliest word was actually Yeats. William Butler Yeats. But I really enjoyed it as a kid, and then when I entered into the public school system, I stopped enjoying it. Not entirely, but I stopped enjoying it because it was more of a survival thing. It was like trying to find out how do I survive this almost machine-like way of getting through education. It was a shift, I think, in the way that education was delivered. So, education, it seems to me, was prior to the 1840s and 50s. I'm only guessing here. Education was an engagement in ideas, and you learn by memory, but also by engaging in the ideas. How do you do the thing? And then when you get into that Prussian model, which we'll talk about in a bit, that Prussian model was more, how do you respond in the way that's appropriate? How do you do lockstep with everybody else? That kind of thing. And I think that the education I got there in the 80s, and then shifting out of it in Trinity, but what I got in the early 80s was very much this machine-like education. It sets a person up to be part of the bureaucracy or part of the machine of the modern era, but it doesn't set you up to really grapple with the ideas behind the text. And that seems to me to be a huge issue, a huge problem that we're facing now. Students, when they're engaging in the ideas, have a lot more motivation to read, to discover, to do things autonomously. If it's just a question of filling out the forms, answering the questions, because we had weekly reader had questions that you would answer at the end, everything from current events to who was Abraham Lincoln, um, when that's all you're doing, well, you're just, it's no different really than filling out a form in the bureaucracy in the Ministry of Circumlocution. It's no different than punching the buttons. So yeah, I think that's a really good place to sort of leap off into the discussion of education in general that I think we wanted to have. What are we about? What are we doing? What is the purpose of all this education? And how does knowing the history of these education fads, like whole language, how does it come about? Where did it originate? And is there a way to fix it? Or are we, you know, doomed to repeat what earlier generations have done? That to me is a very significant question. So my hope in being able to talk about this is to look at some of the more luminous authors that have written about this. John Taylor Gatto, Neil Postman, Diane Ravitch, to look at some of the bête noirs, John Dewey, for instance.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
I'd like to maybe discuss that. I'd like to discuss some more obscure ones. There's a really good text called Madly to Teach by Mortimer. I think his name is John Mortimer, but he wrote back in the 1950s against Dewey, and he has some really good insights.
Mm.
So I think it'd be really good to have discussion about these various things over the course of a period of time. Um, Let me ask one more question now that you say you're engaged in the classroom. I am semi-retired from the classroom. How do you see the trend of education moving now? I mean, we have the whole classical school system thing, and I mean, is that a silver bullet or what?
Well, I think that there are a lot of people who are excited about, you brought up the idea of the classical education. And I think that it's better than what most public schools are doing right now. But I see a lot of problems with it, with the
Mm,
current landscape of essentially where kids are coming from, where their parents have come from with respect to education. So there's a lot of tricky things about trying to use classical education as, like what you said, the silver bullet from my perspective.
mm,
I think that one of the major flaws with trying to use it as a tool to fix things is that we don't really even still understand what it is ourselves. even those of us who have spent years and years studying classical education, it's still kind of nebulous to us if we're being
Yes.
intellectually honest with ourselves. Um, I think so. I'm on the fence about that because we spoke about my own experience with Providence at the beginning of our conversation. And Providence was embarking on this classical education model. And
Yes.
for me, the experience of jumping into that was, I mean, it was alarming at first, but it ended up being a breath of fresh air. And it did end up being the thing that kind of propelled me on to this journey of education where I was interested in ideas. Whereas I don't think that I could have become interested in ideas had I not had that exposure. So I
Mm.
think it can help under the right circumstances, but to say that it's the right solution for every kid or for every family, I don't know if that's true.
Very good insight. I know that I've talked with some people who have tried to implement it, and given the demographic that they're working with, it's not only not it's not applicable, it doesn't help, but it's almost inaccessible for some people. And
Yeah.
so I think one of the questions that we have to ask as an educational body, as a nation, what is the crisis that young people are facing, and what do they need in order to be able to flourish, really? I like to use that
Mhm.
word flourish instead of succeed because it's an
Yeah.
older word first off, but it's what they used to talk about with education, but it also has more of the sense of the person coming into their own rather than just, you know,
Mhm.
I'm going to make it there, I'll make it anywhere sort of thing. Um, but the question of what do they need? What is it that they're facing? What do they need? What would help them in some way? Because I think the classical education is a great thing. I think it's a beautiful thing, but it may or may not be helpful to some people, and
Mhm.
it may or may not be perceived as elitist by some. So that might be a good thing to actually discuss more in depth. What is a classical system? Where did it originate? What are we about? What are we doing? Because in the long run, I think really all of this is about all the discussion that seems to be going is about how do we give the best thing to young people so that they can flourish. It's
Mhm.
not about just pushing the classical thing because that's going to solve all the issues. And it's not about just maintaining our phony baloney jobs, as they say in Blazing Saddles. It's not about that. Sometimes these institutions that have been held up for generations, they need to dissolve, I think, because they are not doing any good anymore, both on the lower academic level, but also on the college level too. But I think we're seeing a profound change in education, and I think that that profound change needs more discussion about what exactly is going on. So I look forward to being able to discuss some of this and reading through John Taylor Gatto. That seems to be a good course. Certainly a rebel in his own right. So maybe we can start there. And I think next week when we do meet, we can start off with Gatto, and I've gotten through, like I said, 30 pages of him, so I have another 20 to go through. We cover 50 pages. We'll be in good shape, don't you think?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay.